Welcome to Mystery Sauce, your go-to place for true crime, cryptic mysteries, and the paranormal. In today's episode, we're exploring the top 5 most sinister and unusual punishments from the annals of dark history. Let's dive right in. Let's begin with a punishment that's as horrifying as it is real, being boiled alive. Now, you might think of this as a cliche from old stories of cannibals, but the stark reality is far different. Boiling someone alive was a capital punishment method used worldwide for years. Picture this: a large copper cauldron, bubbling with boiling liquid, ready to receive its unfortunate victim. The methods varied in their cruelty. Sometimes, the condemned were tied up tightly before being tossed into the scalding brew. In other instances, they would already be in the cauldron as the liquid heated to a deadly boil. Imagine the horror of being suspended, feet first, with only your head submerged in that searing liquid. It wasn't always water in that cauldron. Oils, wax, wine, fats. Each substance added its own gruesome twist to the process. In England, for instance, being boiled alive was a fate reserved for poisoners. Across the European mainland, it was the grim penalty for crimes like forgery or counterfeiting. These executions were often public spectacles. Take the case of Richard Roos, for instance. Punished by Henry VIII for trying to poison John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, Roos's execution was a scene of collective horror. As he was boiled alive, witnesses fainted, sickened by the sight, many wishing for a quicker, less agonizing end for him, if only to spare them the sound of his agonized screams. Then there's the legendary tale from Japan. Ishikawa Gomen, the outlaw who robbed the rich to aid the poor, met his end in a gigantic kettle-shaped bathtub. Along with his son, he was condemned for an attempted assassination of the warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Legend has it that even in those last excruciating moments, Gomen held his son above the boiling water, sparing him as long as he could from the fatal heat. You might think that the gruesome practice of boiling alive belongs to a distant barbaric past, but shockingly, reports suggest it's still happening in this very century. In 2004, there were accounts of the Uzbekistan government using this method against terrorists. Even in Mexico, there are tales of cartels employing this brutal punishment. The very thought of enduring such torment is unimaginable. Yet, as horrific as boiling alive is, it's merely the prelude to an even more nightmarish punishment: flaying. Just hearing the word flaying sends shivers down the spine, conjuring images of unspeakable agony. Flaying is the act of removing a person's skin from their body. The process, done by cutting and peeling the skin over a prolonged period, subjects the victim to excruciating pain, often leaving them alive for hours, even days. In some twisted cases, boiling alive served as a preparation for flaying. Boiling made the victim's skin soft and pliable, easier for the executioner to work with. In other instances, victims were left under the scorching sun, their skin burning and blistering, ready for the cruel procedure. Once the skin was suitably softened, the nightmare truly began. The victim, tied down tightly by their hands and feet, would experience the first incision, usually on the thigh or buttocks. These initial cuts were strategic, designed to keep as much skin intact as possible. As the executioner progressed to more challenging areas, they'd make outline cuts, then gruesomely rip the skin from the victim's body. The suffering didn't end there. Massive blood loss, shock, and the heightened risk of infection were just the beginning. With the skin, our primary defense against pathogens, brutally removed, the exposed muscles and tissues became an open feast for insects. Another terrifying consequence? Hypothermia. The skin is crucial in regulating body temperature, and without it, the victim's body would rapidly lose heat. The chilling history of flaying dates back to at least 900 BC in Assyria. Depictions in ancient palaces illustrated the gruesome fate awaiting those who dared to rebel against their rulers. This brutal practice wasn't just ancient history, though. Even in the Ottoman Empire, flaying was reported. After the execution of Nat Turner for leading a slave rebellion in 1831, his body was flayed, and his skin was grotesquely used to create souvenir purses. While rare, the horror of flaying was beyond imagination. Flaying has even infiltrated our pop culture. Think of Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, House Bolton in Game of Thrones, and the Night Lords in the Warhammer 40K universe. These fictional depictions, though distant from reality, echoed the terror that Flaying inflicted. It's more than just physical torment, it's a desecration of the body, an assault on one of our most vital physical defenses. Now, let's turn to the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel. Used in medieval Europe, this was a method of execution for serious crimes like murder, arson, or theft from the church. The wheel was large, wooden, with spokes and often an iron rim, sometimes even fitted with spikes. The execution involved two stages. First, the condemned person was stripped and tied down, with blocks placed under their joints. Then, the wheel was dropped onto the victim's limbs by the executioner. The method of this torture was chillingly specific. If the sentence was to be particularly painful, the legs were targeted first. If a quick death was granted as mercy, the wheel would strike the head or neck. This process continued until the victim's bones were shattered, but death wasn't immediate. In a grotesque second stage, the victim, now with broken and mangled limbs, was woven through the wheel's spokes. This could only be done because their bones were no longer intact. The body, twisted and contorted, was then displayed as a grim warning. Once the victim was broken by the wheel, the nightmare was far from over. The wheel, with the victim grotesquely entangled within its spokes, would often be mounted on a stake, sometimes even above a fire. In some harrowing instances, the wheel, along with the condemned, would be thrown directly into the flames. Despite this horrific trauma, there were rare occasions where the condemned survived, falling from the wheel. Such miraculous survivals were seen as divine intervention. Those fortunate few were treated for their injuries and set free. The breaking wheel is sometimes referred to as the Catherine wheel, named after the tale of Saint Catherine of Alexandria. She was condemned to die on a breaking wheel for her steadfast Christian faith. Yet, as legend has it, when she touched the wheel, it miraculously shattered, leading to her beheading instead. This tale adds an eerie reverence to an already brutal execution method, but the brutality of the breaking wheel extended even beyond death. Those broken upon it were denied a proper burial. In the Christian faith of the time, this mutilation of the body was believed to rob the victim of any hope of resurrection. The public nature of these executions, along with the ghastly display of the contorted bodies, served as a dire warning to the populace, instilling a deep-seated fear. Our next tale is not of a particular type of punishment, but rather the extreme execution of Balthasar Gérard. In July of 1584, Gérard committed regicide against William the Silent, a leading figure in the Dutch push for reformation and the head of state. Gérard's pride in the assassination, coupled with the gravity of murdering a head of state, led to a sentence of unspeakable cruelty. Before his execution, Gérard was subjected to horrific torture. First, he was hung on a pole and repeatedly lashed. Then, in a bizarre and gruesome twist, his wounds were smeared with honey. A goat was brought in, supposedly to lick the honey and peel the skin from Gérard's wounds. Yet, in a small mercy, the goat refused to participate. But the torment didn't end there. Balthasar. Gérard's ordeal continued in ways that almost defy belief. At night, he was bound hand and foot, tied into a ball to make sleep impossible. Then came the shoes made of uncured dogskin, painfully small for his feet. His feet were held over a fire, causing the skin of the shoes to contract and crush his feet. When the shoes were removed, they tore the skin off with them. But that wasn't the end of it. Boiling fat was poured over Gérard, scalding his already battered flesh. His body, now in tatters, was forced into alcohol-soaked clothing. After enduring 3 days and nights of this relentless torture, Gérard's execution finally arrived. First, his right hand was burned off. Then, flesh was torn from his body in 6 different places. He was quartered and disemboweled, still clinging to life. According to his sentence, his heart was to be ripped out and thrown in his face, and finally, his head was severed. Gérard's head was displayed on a pike at the site of the assassination, while his limbs were placed above the 4 gates of Delft. The next method of execution we delve into is crucifixion, perhaps the most famous due to its association with the Christian faith. While closely linked with the death of Jesus Christ, crucifixion's origins trace back much further. In crucifixion, the condemned was affixed to a wooden cross. There were different types: the crux simplex, a simple pole; the crux commissa, a T-shaped cross; and the crux emissa, the type associated with Jesus. Originating in the Persian Empire and later adopted by the Greeks and Romans, crucifixion was usually reserved for slaves and enemies of the state, a public warning of the consequences of disobedience. Before crucifixion, the condemned were stripped, whipped, and flogged. Contrary to popular belief, it's unlikely they carried the entire cross, weighing around 300 pounds, to the execution site. Instead, the condemned were typically made to carry only the crossbeam to the crucifixion site. Once there, they were affixed to the cross. Nails were hammered through the wrists, not the palms as often depicted. The Greek understanding of hands includes the wrists, which could better support the body's weight. The ankles also bore part of the weight, preventing the entire burden from resting on the wrists alone. Hanging in this way exerted immense pressure on the lungs and heart. Asphyxiation was usually the cause of death on the cross. As the condemned hung, the weight of their body restricted the diaphragm, preventing the lungs from releasing air. The only way to exhale was by pushing up with their nailed feet. Some crosses included a footrest or seat, prolonging the torture by reducing the strain on the body. Death could also come from dehydration, exposure, or succumbing to injuries inflicted before the crucifixion. In Roman executions, guards were posted at the site and weren't allowed to leave until the condemned had died. To hasten death, guards sometimes stabbed or broke the victim's legs. Throughout human history, the myriad forms of torture and execution all point to a uniquely human propensity for imaginative cruelty. The number of methods devised to inflict pain and suffering sadly unites all nations and peoples. This shared history of brutality is a somber reflection of humanity's darkest impulses. That concludes today's story. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing, giving a thumbs up, and leaving a comment to help the channel grow. I aim to upload 3 times a week, and welcome your suggestions for future topics. Feel free to share them in the comments. Thanks for tuning in.